Millionaire hires a nanny black woman. For his sixth son, installs cameras and discovers shocking. In this captivating video, we explore an unexpected tale of kindness and discovery. A wealthy businessman, concerned for his ailing son, hires a nanny. He is seeking someone with experience and compassion, hoping for the best care possible for his child. We'd love to hear. If you're excited about this story, if you had a good time watching the video, go ahead and press 1. If that's not the case, just press 0. Your feedback truly motivates me to collect more heartwarming and significant stories.
On a cold winter morning, the towering Dumas mansion stood like a fortress, its grandeur masking the grief and isolation within. Inside, a powerful millionaire sat in his office, drowning in guilt over his wife's tragic death and consumed by the relentless fear of losing his sick son. But when a determined nanny named Naomi walked through those iron gates, she didn't just bring warmth into the boy's life. She uncovered secrets that would shatter everything the millionaire thought he knew about love, trust, and redemption. What happens when the walls of control begin to crumble? Stay tuned to find out. The grand silhouette of the Dumas mansion stood tall against the late October sky. Its imposing structure, with sprawling terraces and mirrored windows, reflected the golden hues of a fading sunset over New York City. Inside, the air was cold, not from the autumn chill outside, but from the overwhelming emptiness that pervaded every inch of the home. Victor Dumas sat in his office on the top floor, his fingers tracing the rim of a crystal whiskey glass, untouched. His gaze was distant, fixated on the skyline, where the city pulsed with life he no longer felt a part of. The muffled sound of a door opening behind him snapped him out of his thoughts. It was Helen, his assistant of nearly 15 years, carrying a sleek black folder. "Mr. Dumas," she said, her voice professional, but with an undertone of concern. "These are the files for the candidates you requested." Victor didn't turn. His deep brown eyes remained locked on the horizon, as if searching for something he couldn't quite grasp. "How many this time?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, yet carrying the weight of exhaustion. 15, Helen replied, stepping forward. "All with excellent references and experience with children who need special care." Victor finally swiveled his chair around, his expression as sharp as the tailored lines of his suit. He opened the folder and began flipping through the profiles. Each face stared back at him, smiling broadly, their credentials flawless. He hated it. Perfect on paper meant nothing. Perfect didn't exist. "Schedule interviews with the top 3 for tomorrow," he said, snapping the folder shut. Helen hesitated. "Dr. Blackwell called earlier. He's concerned about the frequent changes in caregivers. He mentioned that Theo needs—" Victor cut her off, his tone turning icy. "I pay Dr. Blackwell to manage Theo's health, not to tell me how to run my household." A tense silence filled the room. Helen knew better than to push. She nodded and turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Theo asked if you could have dinner with him tonight." Victor's jaw tightened, the mere mention of his son stirring a storm of guilt and grief he didn't want to confront. "I have a video conference with Tokyo investors," he began, the practiced excuse rolling off his tongue. But the memory of Theo's disappointed face, his green eyes, Eleanor's eyes, dimmed by constant rejection, made him falter. "Cancel the conference," he said finally. "I'll be there at 7. Helen nodded and left without another word, leaving Victor alone with his thoughts. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a photograph. Eleanor smiled back at him, her eyes alive with mischief and warmth. It had been 5 years since the accident, but the pain was as sharp as ever. He traced her face with his thumb, the way he used to trace it in life, and felt the familiar ache in his chest. From downstairs came a sound that broke through his reverie. A cough, light but persistent. Theo's cough. Victor immediately rose, his heart constricting. He descended the grand marble staircase, his footsteps echoing in the vast empty halls. In the living room, Theo sat curled up in his favorite blanket, watching a documentary about ocean life. His golden curls caught the evening light, making him look even more like Eleanor. Beside him stood Mrs. Hathaway, the temporary nanny, holding an inhaler with practiced indifference. When Theo noticed Victor, his face lit up, and for a fleeting moment, Victor felt the tightness in his chest ease. "Dad, are you staying for dinner tonight?" "Yes, champ," Victor said, kneeling beside him. "How about we order that pizza you like?" Theo's eyes sparkled with excitement before another coughing fit overtook him. Victor watched helplessly as Mrs. Hathaway handed the boy the inhaler. Moments like these reminded him of how fragile Theo was and how much he needed to protect him. No, protect wasn't the right word. Shield. He had to shield Theo from the world. Victor's fingers drummed lightly against the table. "Tell me about your last experience," he said, his tone testing. Naomi took a breath, her calm demeanor faltering for just a moment. "I cared for a boy named William for 3 years. He had cystic fibrosis. They were challenging but rewarding years." "And why did you leave?" Naomi hesitated, her voice softening. "William passed away 6 months ago. Afterward, I took some time to process the loss." Victor saw the glint of pain in her eyes and surprisingly felt no annoyance at the vulnerability she allowed to show. Instead, he felt a strange sense of respect. "What makes you think you're ready to take on another case so soon?" "Because grief taught me compassion," Naomi said, her voice firm. "Not fear. Theo deserves someone who can meet him where he is, who can show him that even in the face of challenges, there's room for joy and growth." Victor stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to her. The morning light caught the faint silver strands in his dark hair, highlighting the tension in his shoulders. "Miss Lewis, I need to be upfront. This position requires more than professional competence. There are cameras in every room of the house, and your privacy will be limited. Many find it invasive." Naomi's expression didn't shift. "I understand your need to protect Theo, Mr. Dumas. If I were in your position, I might do the same. But trust," she added, "is built through actions, not surveillance." Victor turned back to her sharply. "Are you questioning my decisions?" "No, sir," she replied evenly. "I'm fulfilling my promise to be honest." A tense silence filled the room. Behind the glass door, Helen, who had been observing discreetly, held her breath. In all her years, she had never seen someone hold their ground so firmly against Victor Dumas. Finally, Victor broke the silence. "Would you like to meet Theo?" On the 4th floor of the mansion, Theo sat on the edge of his bed, his thin frame wrapped in a blanket patterned with constellations. His eyes were glued to a tablet playing an ocean documentary, but the moment Victor entered the room, the boy's face lit up. "Dad!" Theo exclaimed, his voice hoarse but filled with excitement. His gaze quickly shifted to Naomi. "Who's she?" "This is Miss Lewis," Victor said, his voice softer now. "She might be spending some time with you." Naomi stepped forward, crouching slightly to meet Theo at eye level. "You must be Theo," she said warmly. "I hear you're an expert on ocean life." Theo's face lit up. "Do you like whales?" "I love whales," Naomi said. "Did you know humpback whales sing different songs every year?" Theo's eyes widened. "No way." As Naomi and Theo chatted, Victor stood by the door, watching the interaction with a mix of skepticism and reluctant hope. Naomi seamlessly wove therapeutic breathing exercises into the conversation, gently guiding Theo through moments of labored breaths without him even realizing he was being treated. For the first time in weeks, Theo's laughter filled the room. "Dad," Theo called out suddenly. "She's different from the others." Victor nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Naomi. "Yes, she is." Later that evening, Victor sat in his office, staring at the contract Richard had finalized for Naomi's employment. Helen entered, carrying a cup of coffee. "The other candidates are still waiting for their interviews." "Cancel them," Victor said without looking up. "Ms. Lewis starts tomorrow." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" She was quite frank during the interview. "Exactly why," Victor replied. "Theo needs someone like her, someone who isn't afraid to tell the truth, even to me." As Helen left, Victor turned on the monitors again. He replayed the footage of Naomi and Theo's first meeting. There was something about the way she engaged with his son, a mixture of professionalism and genuine care that he couldn't ignore. For the first time in years, Victor allowed himself a glimmer of hope. Perhaps he had found someone who could bring light back into the dark, empty halls of his life. The dawn light filtered through the Dumas mansion's towering windows, casting soft amber hues across the marble floors. Naomi Lewis arrived promptly at 7 a.m., carrying a modest bag and a small package wrapped in colorful paper. Her attire was simple, yet professional, but her calm, unhurried demeanor stood in stark contrast to the brisk, calculated efficiency that characterized the mansion's staff. Helen greeted her in the grand entrance hall, her heeled shoes echoing against the cold, polished surfaces. "Good morning, Miss Lewis," Helen said, her tone neutral but curious. She gestured for Naomi to follow. Mr. Dumas left detailed instructions about Theo's routine. The list of medications, therapy schedules, and emergency contacts is in his room. As they ascended the sweeping staircase, Naomi caught glimpses of the house's grandeur, intricately carved balustrades, vaulted ceilings adorned with crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with austere portraits of generations of Dumas ancestors. Yet, despite its opulence, the mansion felt hollow, like a gilded cage. On the second floor, Helen paused in front of a door adorned with glow-in-the-dark stars. "Theo had a difficult night," she said softly. "The change in temperature always affects his breathing." Naomi nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Could I see the records from last night? It would help me understand his breathing patterns better." Helen blinked, momentarily taken aback by the request, but nodded. "Of course, I'll have them sent to you." Inside, Theo was stirring restlessly in his bed. His cheeks were flushed, and the steady beep of the heart monitor filled the quiet room. Naomi approached him silently, her movements measured, her gaze assessing. She knelt beside him and whispered, "Good morning, little navigator." Theo's eyes fluttered open, and he blinked at her in confusion. Slowly, a small smile crept onto his face. "You came," he said, his voice raspy but full of wonder. "Of course I came," Naomi replied, her tone light and warm. She pulled the colorful package from her bag and handed it to him. "And I brought something special for you." Theo carefully unwrapped the gift, revealing a miniature constellation projector. His green eyes lit up as he turned it over in his hands. "Wow! It's like having the universe in my room." Naomi smiled. "I thought we could create our own starry ocean here. But first," she added with a playful tilt of her head, "how about a nutritious breakfast to regain your energy?" From his private office, Victor Dumas watched the interaction through the monitors. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, as though he could adjust something to maintain control. The natural ease with which Naomi moved around Theo's room unsettled him. She wasn't just taking care of his son. She was engaging him, drawing him out of the shell he'd built over the years. It was both a relief and a challenge to his tightly held assumptions. By mid-morning, Naomi had established a gentle rhythm with Theo. She turned breathing exercises into imaginative games, wove stories into nebulizer sessions, and introduced small but meaningful adjustments to his routine. During lunch, Victor entered the kitchen unexpectedly to find Theo at the table, enthusiastically eating a colorful soup. "What kind of soup is that?" Victor asked, arching a skeptical eyebrow. Naomi turned to him without missing a beat. "It's my special recipe," she said, undeterred, "rich in nutrients and low in sodium, as per the dietary restrictions. The secret is fresh herbs." "Dad, try it," Theo exclaimed, holding out a spoon. "It doesn't taste like medicine." Victor hesitated, then accepted the spoonful his son offered. To his surprise, the soup was delicious. "It's good," he admitted reluctantly. "Thank you," Naomi said with a small smile. "Good nutrition is part of good care." After lunch, Victor requested a private conversation. In his office, he closed the door and turned to Naomi, his expression unreadable. "I appreciate your initiative," he began, "but any changes to Theo's diet need to be approved first." "With all due respect, Mr. Dumas," Naomi replied, handing him a neatly printed document, "the soup adheres to all his dietary restrictions. I've provided a detailed breakdown of its nutritional content." Victor studied the document, his analytical gaze searching for flaws but finding none. "I see you've thought this through," he said at last, "but I need to be clear. My son's care requires precision. Naomi met his gaze evenly. I understand. But precision doesn't have to mean rigidity. If we turn every part of his care into something clinical, Theo won't just survive. He'll forget how to live. Victor's jaw tightened at her words. He wanted to argue, but the conviction in her tone disarmed him. You believe you know what's best for my son? I believe we both want what's best for him, Naomi said softly. And that means taking calculated risks to let him experience the world, even in small ways. That evening, Naomi found a drawing on Theo's bedside table, 3 stick figures under a starry sky, one tall, one small, and one medium-sized. They were all smiling. Attached was a note in Theo's shaky handwriting. Thanks for bringing the stars, Miss Naomi. Victor discovered the drawing later, placed carefully on his desk. Beneath it, Naomi had left a note. Mr. Dumas. Theo has dreams bigger than his room. Sometimes the greatest acts of protection involve allowing small freedoms. Respectfully, Naomi Lewis. Victor stared at the note for a long moment, Eleanor's voice echoing in his mind. Love without freedom is a gilded cage. Victor. The first month passed in a series of subtle but undeniable changes. Theo's laughter became a regular occurrence. He grew more engaged with his therapy, and his energy improved. Even Victor, though still a distant figure in the household, began spending more time at home, drawn by the unmistakable shift in the atmosphere. One morning, while reviewing the cameras, Victor paused at the feed from Theo's room. Naomi had set up the constellation projector, creating a mesmerizing galaxy of stars and ocean waves on the ceiling. Theo lay beneath it, his breathing steady, his eyes alight with wonder. Victor closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Perhaps for the first time in years, he could let himself believe that the world outside his carefully built walls might not be as threatening as he feared. And perhaps Naomi Lewis was the reason why. The soft patter of rain against the windows echoed through the Dumas mansion, its expansive halls dimmed by the approaching storm. The world outside blurred into a palette of gray, but inside Theo's room, warmth radiated. The constellation projector cast an ethereal glow of stars and rippling ocean waves onto the ceiling, turning the room into a cocoon of wonder. Naomi sat cross-legged on the floor beside Theo's bed, a storybook in hand. And that's how the humpback whale sings its songs, Theo, she finished, glancing at him. His face, pale but animated, glowed with excitement. Do you think I'll ever hear a real whale song? Theo asked, his voice tinged with both hope and uncertainty. Naomi paused, meeting his gaze. I think, she said softly, you'll do more than hear it. One day, you'll see the whales too. Theo's eyes sparkled. Promise? Promise, Naomi replied, her tone firm. Standing outside the partially open door, Victor watched the exchange. He had intended to step in, but something held him back. It wasn't just the way Naomi spoke to Theo, as though his dreams were valid and achievable. It was the way Theo looked at her, as though she were a lighthouse, guiding him through the storms of his life. Victor's grip on the door frame tightened. He hadn't realized how much he'd relied on control to shield himself from the fear of losing Theo. Yet, here was Naomi, dismantling his walls one interaction at a time, offering Theo something Victor couldn't quantify: hope. The storm outside intensified as night fell. Sheets of rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Theo had drifted off to sleep, his breathing steadied by the nebulizer, when Naomi quietly left his room to organize her notes. She barely had time to sit down before she heard the familiar rhythm of Theo's heart monitor shift. Naomi froze. She was out of her chair and running down the hall in an instant. When she reached Theo's room, she found Victor already there, his usually composed face etched with panic. Theo was sitting upright, clutching his chest, his breaths coming in shallow, uneven gasps. The heart monitor's beeping was rapid and shrill. I called Dr. Blackwell, Victor said, his voice tight with urgency. The ambulance is on its way. Naomi placed a hand on Victor's arm, steadying him. Theo can't handle the cold, wet air outside right now. We'll stabilize him here. Victor looked at her, torn between doubt and desperation. What do we do? Naomi knelt beside Theo, her voice calm and soothing as she addressed the boy. Theo, remember the diver we talked about? The one who rises to the surface slowly? Theo nodded weakly. Good. You're the diver now, Naomi said, taking his small hand in hers. I want you to breathe with me, one slow breath at a time. She guided him, her own breaths deep and deliberate. Slowly, Theo's ragged breathing began to sync with hers, though the strain was still evident on his face. Victor stood frozen, unsure of where he fit in the scene. Naomi turned to him sharply. Mr. Dumas, sit behind him. Let him lean against you. He needs to feel your breath. Victor hesitated for the briefest moment before lowering himself onto the bed. He gently pulled Theo back against his chest, his arms cradling his son protectively. Naomi resumed her steady breathing, and Theo followed, his breath slowly evening out. Tell him a story, Naomi urged, her voice low but firm. Something he knows. Something comforting. Victor faltered. A story? I'm not good at... Yes, you are, Naomi interrupted, her gaze unwavering. Just start. Victor swallowed hard, his voice shaking as he began. Theo, do you remember the first time your mother and I took you to the aquarium? You were barely 3, and you kept calling the jellyfish blobby fish. His voice softened as he continued, recounting every detail of the trip. Eleanor's laughter, Theo's fascination with the sharks, the way he'd clung to Victor's hand. As Victor spoke, Theo's breathing slowed and the tension in his small body eased. Naomi checked his vitals again and nodded, relief flooding her features. He's stabilizing, she murmured. Victor's voice trailed off, his focus entirely on Theo. He hadn't realized how tightly he'd been holding his son until he felt Theo's small hand relax in his own. Once Theo was asleep, Naomi moved to adjust the star projector, casting a soft, ocean-like glow around the room. Victor remained seated on the bed, his hand still resting on Theo's back, as though afraid to let go. Naomi placed a blanket over Theo and turned to Victor. He's going to be okay, she said gently. Victor looked up at her, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. How do you do it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Do what? Stay so calm, Victor said, his gaze fixed on her. You didn't even hesitate. Naomi hesitated, her own walls threatening to rise. I've seen moments like this before, she admitted, her voice quiet. With William, my brother. He had cystic fibrosis. I learned that fear doesn't help. It only clouds your judgment. Victor nodded slowly, absorbing her words. You cared for him. For 3 years, Naomi replied. Until the end. The weight of her confession lingered between them. Victor saw for the first time the quiet strength that Naomi carried, not just as a caregiver, but as someone who had faced immense loss and still found the courage to give. Thank you, Victor said finally, his voice heavy with sincerity. For everything tonight. Naomi offered a small smile. It's my job. Victor shook his head. No, it's more than that. It's who you are. As the storm subsided in the early hours of the morning, Naomi and Victor remained in Theo's room. Naomi sat in the armchair by the bed, organizing her notes, while Victor stayed beside Theo, his hand resting lightly on his son's shoulder. For the first time in years, Victor allowed himself to feel something other than fear, hope. And for the first time in years, he realized he wasn't navigating the storm alone. The storm outside had passed, leaving the morning air crisp and clean. Pale sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Dumas mansion, illuminating the quiet stillness of Theo's room. Victor sat in the chair beside his son's bed, his suit jacket draped carelessly over the armrest. Theo was still asleep, his breath steady and calm for the first time in hours. Victor's eyes lingered on Theo's face, taking in the soft rise and fall of his small chest. The crisis had passed, but its shadow lingered in Victor's mind. For years he had prided himself on control, over his business, his home, even the air Theo breathed. But last night, as his son's life teetered on the edge, it wasn't his control that had saved Theo. It was Naomi. Naomi. Victor turned his head to where she sat, her posture relaxed but her expression thoughtful. She was organizing a stack of medical records, her movements efficient yet gentle. She glanced up and caught his gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Did you sleep at all?" Naomi asked softly, breaking the silence. Victor shook his head. "No. I didn't want to leave him." Naomi studied him for a moment, her dark eyes searching his face. "You were there when he needed you most. That's what matters." Her words struck something deep within him, though he couldn't quite articulate why. "You make it sound so simple." "It is," Naomi said. "Showing up, that's half the battle." Victor leaned back in his chair, his exhaustion evident. "You make it look easy." "It's not," Naomi admitted, her voice softening. "But when you care about someone, you find a way." Her words hung in the air, and Victor found himself wanting to ask more, to understand how she managed to carry so much without breaking. But before he could speak, Theo stirred, his small voice breaking the moment. "Dad?" Theo whispered, his green eyes fluttering open. Victor leaned forward, brushing a hand over Theo's curls. "I'm here, champ. How are you feeling?" "Better," Theo murmured, his gaze drifting to Naomi. A faint smile crossed his lips. "Miss Naomi stayed too?" "I did," Naomi replied, moving to sit beside him. "You had quite the adventure last night, didn't you?" Theo nodded, his small hand reaching for hers. "Thank you." Naomi's heart softened at the boy's sincerity. "You're welcome, Theo. But you were the brave one." Victor watched the exchange, a strange warmth spreading through his chest. Theo wasn't just safe, he was happy. And for the first time in a long while, Victor felt something he couldn't quite name, a flicker of trust. Later that morning, as Theo rested, Victor found Naomi in the library, her attention focused on a medical journal spread across the large oak table. She looked up when he entered, her expression cautious but open. "Naomi," Victor began, hesitating briefly before continuing. "I owe you an apology." She tilted her head slightly. "For what?" "For not trusting you," Victor admitted. He gestured toward a nearby chair, and she nodded, inviting him to sit. "I've spent so long relying on control, on walls and cameras, to protect Theo. But last night," he paused, his voice thick with emotion, "you didn't just save my son. You showed me that some things can't be controlled. They just need to be felt." Naomi folded her hands, her gaze steady. "It's not easy to let go of control when you're afraid of losing someone." Victor nodded slowly. "Eleanor, my wife, used to tell me the same thing. She said I treated love like a fortress. And when she died," he trailed off, his jaw tightening. "I built that fortress higher, stronger. I thought it was the only way to keep Theo safe." Naomi leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but firm. "Fortresses might keep danger out, Mr. Dumas, but they also keep love out. Theo needs you, not just as his protector, but as his father." Victor looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "You're right," he said finally. "I just don't know if I can be both." "You already are," Naomi replied, her tone unwavering. "Last night proved that." For a moment they sat in silence, the gravity of their conversation settling between them. Then Victor leaned back, his expression softening. "You've given me a lot to think about." "That's what I'm here for," Naomi said with a faint smile. "For Theo, and for you." Over the next few weeks, the dynamic in the Dumas household began to shift. Victor started spending more time at home, observing Theo's therapy sessions and even participating in small ways. He watched as Naomi worked with Theo, her methods blending playfulness with practicality. Theo, in turn, grew stronger, not just physically, but emotionally. He laughed more, his eyes brighter than they'd been in years. Victor found himself drawn not just to Naomi's skill, but to her unwavering compassion. She had a way of seeing through the chaos, finding the heart of what mattered most. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Victor's walls began to crack. One evening, as Victor reviewed reports in his office, he found himself distracted by a drawing Theo had left on his desk. It depicted three figures, himself, Theo, and Naomi, standing beneath a starry sky. Above them, a golden figure floated, radiating light. Victor traced the lines of the drawing, his chest tightening. He knew what the golden figure represented: Eleanor. And yet, the image didn't feel like a replacement. It felt like an extension, a new chapter of their story. As he stared at the drawing, Victor realized something he hadn't allowed himself to admit before. For the first time since Eleanor's death, the mansion no longer felt like a place of mourning. It felt like a home. A clear winter morning settled over the Dumas mansion, with frost dusting the garden outside and sunlight streaming in through the tall windows. Inside, the house was alive in a way it hadn't been in years. Theo's laughter echoed faintly from his room, where Naomi was leading him through a series of breathing exercises disguised as a storytelling game. Victor sat in his office, the sound drifting through the walls as he stared at a financial report he had read 3 times without absorbing a word. He closed the folder with a sigh, pushing it aside. The business no longer held his full attention, something he hadn't experienced in decades. His mind wandered constantly now, pulled toward Theo's growing strength and Naomi's calming presence. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock. Helen stepped inside, a folder in hand, and her expression unusually serious. "Mr. Dumas, you asked me to look into the details of Eleanor's accident." Victor stiffened. He hadn't expected the report so soon. "And?" Helen hesitated, her eyes searching his face. "There's something you need to see." Later that afternoon, Naomi found Victor standing by the window in his office, his shoulders rigid, his gaze fixed on the snowy garden outside. Something about his posture made her pause. "Mr. Dumas?" she said softly, stepping inside. He didn't turn, but she saw the tension in his jaw. "Is everything all right?" For a long moment, Victor didn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, measured, but edged with something darker. "Do you ever wonder, Miss Lewis, if some wounds never heal?" Naomi blinked, caught off guard by the sudden vulnerability in his tone. "I think," she said carefully, "that some wounds don't heal the way we expect them to, but that doesn't mean we can't find ways to live with them." Victor turned to face her, and she was struck by the haunted look in his eyes. He held up a document, a police report, its edges worn as if it had been read too many times. "The brakes on Eleanor's car didn't fail because of wear or neglect," he said. "They were tampered with." Naomi's breath caught. "Tampered?" Victor nodded, his expression hardening. "Someone within my company sabotaged her car. She was collateral damage in a business rivalry." His voice faltered, his jaw tightening. "I've spent years building walls to keep Theo safe. But those walls didn't protect Eleanor. They didn't stop someone from taking her from me." Naomi's heart ached at the raw pain in his voice. She stepped closer, her voice steady but soft. "What are you going to do?" Victor exhaled sharply, his hands clenching into fists. "Find out who did it. Hold them accountable. But..." He paused, his gaze shifting to the desk where Theo's drawing still sat. "What if all of this, everything I've done to protect Theo, what if it's not enough?" Naomi hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "Victor, you've built walls so high that even love struggles to get through. But Theo doesn't need a fortress. He needs you. Present, vulnerable, human." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time, Victor didn't have an immediate retort. Instead, he looked at her, truly looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. "You have a way of saying the things I need to hear, even when I don't want to hear them." Naomi smiled faintly. "It's part of the job." "No," Victor said, his voice softer now. "It's part of who you are." That evening, the tension in the house was palpable. Victor had spent hours reviewing every detail of the police report, cross-referencing it with his company records. Naomi, sensing his turmoil, focused her energy on Theo, distracting the boy with stories of ocean adventures and playful games. As night fell, the house grew quiet. Naomi found herself standing on the balcony outside Theo's room, gazing at the frost-covered garden. The air was crisp, each breath forming a faint cloud in front of her. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Victor approach until he spoke. "Do you ever stop working?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of warmth. Naomi turned, surprised to find him leaning casually against the doorframe. "I wouldn't call this work," she replied with a small smile. "Sometimes it's nice to just breathe." Victor stepped out onto the balcony, the cold air making his breath visible. For a moment, neither of them spoke, their gazes fixed on the snowy landscape. "I used to come out here with Eleanor," Victor said suddenly, his voice quiet. "She loved the snow. She said it made everything feel clean, like a blank slate." Naomi glanced at him, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his tone. "She sounds like she was an incredible woman." "She was," Victor said, his expression softening as he spoke. "She taught me how to find joy in the small moments. How to let go of control, even if just for a little while." He paused, his gaze dropping to the ground. "But I didn't listen. Not enough. And now I don't know how." Naomi reached out, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "You're trying, Victor. That's what matters." He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. "I don't know if I can do this without you." The admission hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Naomi felt her heart race, a mix of empathy and something deeper. "You're not alone," she said softly. "You have Theo. And you have me." Victor's gaze held hers, and for a moment the cold seemed to disappear. The air between them crackled with unspoken possibilities, but before either of them could speak, a faint sound came from Theo's room. "Dad?" Theo's voice called out, small and uncertain. Victor immediately stepped inside, with Naomi close behind. They found Theo sitting up in bed, clutching the constellation projector. His green eyes, so much like Eleanor's, were wide with worry. "Dad," Theo said, his voice trembling. "Are you going to leave me too?" Victor's heart shattered at the question. He knelt beside the bed, his hands resting gently on Theo's. "Never," he said firmly. "I will never leave you, Theo. I promise." Naomi stood silently by the door, watching the scene unfold. As Victor reassured Theo, she felt a deep respect for the man he was becoming. He wasn't perfect, far from it, but he was trying. And that was enough. The morning sun cast golden rays across the frost-laden garden of the Dumas estate, but inside the mansion, a different kind of warmth was beginning to take hold. Naomi entered the kitchen, her movements measured but purposeful, and was greeted by the faint hum of activity, a sound that once would have been drowned in the silence of an empty house. She paused at the sight of Victor, sitting at the kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee, his tie loose and his expression uncharacteristically relaxed. "Good morning," Naomi said, her tone light but curious. Victor glanced up, offering a faint smile. "Morning, Miss Lewis." She arched a brow. "It's Naomi." Victor smirked, setting his mug down. "Good morning, Naomi." Naomi moved to the counter to prepare a small tray of tea for Theo, aware of Victor's gaze lingering on her. "How's Theo this morning?" she asked, not turning around. "Better," Victor replied, his voice softer. "He slept through the night for the first time in weeks. He was asking about you when I checked on him." Naomi glanced over her shoulder, her smile warm. "He's resilient." Victor nodded, his expression growing thoughtful. "He gets that from you." The compliment hung in the air between them, unspoken emotions threading through the quiet room. Naomi turned back to her task, feeling the weight of Victor's words settle somewhere deep in her chest. In Theo's room, the boy was propped up in bed, flipping through a book about ocean creatures. He looked up as Naomi entered with the tray, his face lighting up. "Miss Naomi, did you know that octopuses can camouflage?" "I did," Naomi said, setting the tray on his bedside table. "Did you know they also have 3 hearts?" "3?" Theo's eyes widened. "That's so cool," Naomi laughed, sitting beside him. "It is. Imagine all the love you could hold with 3 hearts." Theo looked thoughtful. Like Mom? He asked softly. Naomi's smile faltered, but she nodded. Yes, like your mom. Theo's gaze dropped to the star projector sitting on his bedside table. Do you think she can see us? Like, from the stars? Naomi reached out, brushing a strand of hair from his face. I think she sees everything you do, Theo, and I think she's so proud of you. Theo smiled faintly, a glimmer of comfort easing the shadows in his expression. Thanks, Miss Naomi. The next morning, the Dumas mansion was cloaked in a somber quiet. Victor sat at the head of the dining table, his coffee untouched, as the details of the investigation weighed heavily on him. The name Maxwell Bennett echoed in his mind. A man he had once trusted with the inner workings of his empire, now revealed as the architect of his family's greatest tragedy. Naomi entered the room, her movements as steady as ever, but her eyes lingered on Victor's drawn expression. She approached cautiously, placing a hand on the back of one of the chairs. You didn't sleep, she observed softly. Victor didn't deny it. I don't think I could have if I tried. Naomi sat across from him, her gaze steady but gentle. What are you going to do? Victor's jaw tightened. I've already contacted the authorities. Maxwell's confession is in their hands now. But it doesn't feel like enough. It won't bring Eleanor back, Naomi said, her voice filled with quiet understanding. But justice isn't about undoing the past. It's about ensuring the future is safer. Victor leaned back, running a hand through his hair. I've spent years building this fortress around Theo, convinced it would keep him safe. And now, I realize the real danger was inside all along. Naomi reached out, resting her hand lightly on the table between them. You're not the same man you were then, Victor. You've grown. And Theo is growing too, because of you. Victor looked at her, his expression softening. Because of us, he corrected. Later that day, Victor made the decision to confront Maxwell face to face. Against Naomi's cautious advice, he arranged a meeting at a neutral location, a high-security holding facility where Maxwell had been detained after the evidence against him surfaced. The sterile meeting room was cold and unwelcoming, its fluorescent lights casting sharp shadows across the stark white walls. Victor sat at a steel table, his hands folded tightly, as the door opened. Maxwell entered, his once proud demeanor replaced by a worn, haggard expression. He was escorted by 2 guards who left after ensuring the room was secure. Victor, Maxwell began, his voice a mix of arrogance and desperation. I'm glad you came. I've been wanting to explain. Victor's glare was ice. Explain? You sabotaged my wife's car. You killed her, Maxwell. What explanation could possibly justify that? Maxwell faltered, his shoulders sagging under Victor's fury. I didn't mean for her to die, he said, his voice cracking. I just wanted to scare you, to make you step back. I thought it would. Would what? Victor interrupted, his voice low but seething. Make me hand you the reins of my company. Destroy everything I built for my family. Maxwell's silence was deafening. Victor leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Maxwell's. You didn't just take my wife. You took Theo's mother. You shattered our lives. And for what? A grudge? Maxwell's lips trembled, but he had no words to offer. Victor straightened, his voice cold and resolute. The law will deal with you now. I don't need your apology, Maxwell. I don't need anything from you. But I will make sure you pay for what you did. As Victor rose to leave, Maxwell called after him. Victor, wait. Please. I was angry, yes, but I was lost. You don't understand. Victor stopped at the door, his back to Maxwell. You're right. I don't understand. Because I could never destroy someone's life out of greed. And that's the difference between us. He left without looking back, his footsteps echoing through the sterile hallways. That evening, after Theo had gone to bed, Victor found himself standing on the balcony outside his office. The cold air stung his cheeks, but he welcomed the clarity it brought. The confrontation with Maxwell had unearthed emotions he'd buried for years, grief, guilt, and a simmering anger he hadn't fully processed. Naomi appeared beside him, her presence grounding. She didn't speak, simply leaning on the railing and gazing at the stars. I thought facing Maxwell would bring closure, Victor said eventually, his voice quiet. But it didn't. Not entirely. Naomi glanced at him. Closure isn't about the other person, Victor. It's about deciding to move forward despite what they've done. Victor nodded slowly, her words settling over him like a balm. I want to move forward, he admitted. For Theo, for myself. But I don't know where to start. Naomi turned to face him fully, her gaze steady. You've already started, Victor. Every time you show up for Theo, every time you let someone in, you're moving forward. Victor looked at her, his expression softening. You make it sound so simple. It's not, Naomi said, a small smile tugging at her lips. But it's worth it. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the stars above them twinkling faintly. Finally, Victor spoke again, his voice quieter, but no less certain. You've been the anchor in all of this, Naomi. For Theo. For me. Naomi's breath caught, the weight of his words settling in her chest. You don't have to thank me, Victor. It's who I am. Victor turned toward her, his expression earnest. And it's exactly who we needed. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. But neither of them moved to break it. Instead, they let the quiet linger, their shared understanding bridging the gap between their guarded hearts. Victor woke early the next day to find Theo in the library, engrossed in his latest project. Naomi was seated nearby, helping him sketch out an elaborate ocean scene for a school assignment. Victor lingered in the doorway, watching the easy interaction between them. It felt natural, something he hadn't thought possible after Eleanor's death. Dad, Theo called, breaking Victor's thoughts. Come help us. Victor hesitated briefly, then smiled and walked into the room. What's the assignment? We're making a poster about saving the whales, Theo said enthusiastically. Miss Naomi said I could use real facts. Victor glanced at Naomi, who met his gaze with a quiet smile. Sounds important. How can I help? Theo handed him a stack of markers. You can color the water. Victor chuckled and sat beside his son. As they worked together, a sense of peace settled over him. For the first time in years, Victor felt the weight of his grief lifting. In its place was something new, a fragile hope for the future. A week later, Naomi suggested an outing to the aquarium. Theo's excitement was immediate, but Victor hesitated. The thought of Theo being in a crowded public space filled him with unease. Victor, Naomi said gently, he's stronger than you think. And this could be a big step for him? After a long pause, Victor nodded. Let's do it. At the aquarium, Theo's joy was infectious. He pressed his hands against the glass, watching dolphins glide gracefully through the water. Victor stood a few steps back, his eyes never leaving his son. Naomi joined him, her presence reassuring. He's happy, Victor said, his voice tinged with emotion. Naomi nodded. He's thriving, Victor. And so are you. For the first time, Victor allowed himself to believe her. That evening, back at the mansion, Theo presented Naomi with a drawing. It was a simple image of three figures, Victor, Theo, and Naomi, standing under a starry sky. Above them was a glowing golden figure. Eleanor. It's us, Theo explained. And Mom's watching over us? Naomi felt her throat tighten as she looked at the drawing. It's beautiful, Theo. Thank you. Victor watched the exchange silently, his emotions swirling. Later, as they stood on the balcony together, he turned to Naomi. Naomi, he began, his voice steady but vulnerable. You've changed everything. Not just for Theo, but for me. I don't think I could have done this without you. Naomi's breath caught, but before she could respond, Victor continued. You've become part of this family, and I don't want that to ever change. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Naomi's eyes widened as he opened it, revealing a delicate sapphire ring surrounded by tiny diamonds. Will you marry me? Victor asked, his voice low and filled with hope. Naomi stared at him, her emotions overwhelming. Victor, are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything, Victor said. You brought light back into our lives. You gave Theo a chance to dream again. You gave me a chance to love again. Tears filled Naomi's eyes as she nodded. Yes, Victor smiled, slipping the ring onto her finger. In the quiet of the night, with the stars above and the promise of a brighter future, their lives intertwined in a way neither had thought possible, the Dumas mansion was transformed into a winter wonderland for the wedding. Theo served as the ring bearer, his face glowing with excitement as he watched his father and Naomi exchange vows. The ceremony was intimate, attended only by close friends and family, but the love in the room was palpable. During the reception, Theo took Naomi's hand. "I think Mom's happy," he said confidently. "She said you'd take care of Dad's heart." Naomi knelt down, pulling Theo into a hug. "I'll do my best, Theo, for both of you." Victor joined them, placing a hand on Naomi's shoulder and the other on Theo's head. For the first time in years, they felt whole, a family.